Hello all, I wanted to talk briefly about the anatomy of the alimentary canal, or the gastrointestinal tract. So the tube that runs from the mouth all the way to the anus and everything in between. And like the other hollow tubes and organs that we've talked about in this class, it has on the inside a mucosa, right? Right here, it's a little bit more complex than most of the epithelial layers we talked about, but it is, similar. In the middle, there is muscle layer, and on the outside, there is a layer to package it all together. But let's talk about this, because again, it is a little more complex. So the mucosa itself, right, this inner layer, has a couple of layers itself. The muscle layer has a couple of layers itself, and the outer layer is also a little bit more complex. So to back up a little bit, the mucosa has a layer of epithelium that lines the inside. Most of it is simple columnar epithelium through the intestines, but obviously up in a place like your mouth, it's stratified squamous epithelium to protect from from friction and losing cells in that way. The submucosa is an extra layer below the mucosa that's full of connective tissue, and that connective tissue allows blood vessels to come in, lymphatic vessels, nerves, things like that. A lot of secretory glands are there, but it's where mostly blood vessels come in, right? And that's pretty important to bring blood to the mucosa, because the whole point of this thing is to absorb nutrients into your body. And then you get to the muscular layer, which again has two layers, an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer. Circular layer allows you to make the tube narrower, right? Longitudinal layer allows you to make the tube shorter. And then in the outer layer you have something called a serosa, which is just like the outer layer of the heart. The epicardium is also the visceral pericardium, right? It's part of the pericardial cavity, but it's the layer on the inside that's right on the heart. The serosa on the outside of the alimentary canal is also the visceral peritoneum, and there's a parietal peritoneum outside of that, and in between is a peritoneal cavity. So again, you can see the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and the serosa. There are villi, little finger-like projections that come off to increase the surface area, particularly in the small intestines. Okay, inside the digestive tract there are also two plexuses. And a plexus, as you might remember from last semester, is a network of nerves that come together, right? So we talked about your cervical plexus and your brachial plexus, lumbosacral plexus last semester. These are smaller and they're found next to muscle layers, but you have a submucosal plexus that is in the submucosa, right? That innervates some muscles that are found in the mucosa. There's an extra muscle layer in the mucosa. And then there is a bigger myenteric plexus that is right next to the muscularis externa, right? In fact, it's in between the circular and longitudinal layers, and it helps control that. So you have neurons right there on site to control that smooth muscle, and that allows you to push food through, right, your canal. So again, this is a closer look. Here's your mucosa. It has an epithelial layer. It has a connective tissue layer below it for some blood vessels, and it has its own muscle layer called the muscularis mucosa. That doesn't push food through, but it does allow you to sort of wiggle the villi. So all of those layers are part of the mucosa. Next layer is the submucosa, which has lots of connective tissue full of blood vessels and lymphatic vessels and nerves. And in there you also have one of those plexuses, right? Then you have the muscularis externa, which has a circular layer and a longitudinal layer with the myenteric plexus in between. And then you have the serosa on the outside of all of that. The muscularis externa is mainly there to do two kinds of motion. So one is called peristalsis. And peristalsis is a wave of contraction that goes like this, right? Okay. It essentially alternates between a wave of circular muscle contraction and a wave of longitudinal muscle contraction, which again makes the whole tube shorter, and that helps squeeze your food through. So imagine you have a toothpaste and you're squeezing it, from the bottom like a normal human being, right? You don't just grab the toothpaste tube in the middle, squeeze, okay? You squeeze it from the bottom. That's peristalsis. Also, you can imagine a worm moving, like an earthworm, right? We could probably still do that on lockdown, right? Go outside and watch an earthworm in the dirt. That is peristalsis, and that moves your food through. This is all smooth muscle, which means it's all involuntary, right? You don't have to think to move food through your gut. In fact, you can't intentionally move food through your gut, right? Like, wait. No, I tried to move my lunch through a little further. I couldn't do it. So this is a figure from your book that shows you this wave of contraction called peristalsis, moving food through. There's another type of movement called segmentation, and instead of this wave, right, you get sort of, it goes back and forth, and that's for mixing, right? Like you can imagine your washer, agitating, going back and forth. That helps mix up the contents with the intestinal secretions, and so you're more likely to have the food that fragments that you still have mix up with the enzymes. There's not a directionality to it, right? Peristalsis moves things in a direction, right, from mouth toward anus. Segmentation just churns, right? And so you can see it mixing things up there. Well, what causes this stuff to start moving, right? Your stomach and your intestines, your alimentary canal responds to stimuli when they start secreting things and having muscle movements. Well, some of those stimuli are local factors, and that usually is just either there's some sort of change in the chemical content or pH of the area, right? Or there's physical distortion, right? So like when food shows up, obviously the chemical contents of your gut change, but also your food takes up space, so it pushes out. You have stretch receptors that distort, that sense that distortion. So that can cause local parts of your alimentary canal to secrete things and cause movement. But there are also some neural control mechanisms. So short reflexes and long reflexes. Short reflexes just go to that myenteric plexus that we talked about, right, and cause it to move either through peristalsis or to mix through segmentation using that muscularis externa. Long reflexes go all the way to your central nervous system, right, so that you have some central control over all of this. And this controls large-scale stuff, right, like moving food from one region to another. So, for instance, some of these mechanisms help you move, when you eat breakfast in the morning and then all of a sudden you have to go to the bathroom. That's not your breakfast that you're getting rid of. That's your body knowing that you have more food coming in, telling you to get rid of, maybe yesterday's breakfast or the dinner from, a couple of nights before. Right? There are hormonal mechanisms that help regulate all of this too, and we'll talk about some of those hormones that are secreted from different parts of your alimentary canal. Right. So again, some local factors, so some stretching and some chemical changes that cause local secretory cells to release buffers, enzymes, move your villi. You've got short-term reflexes, which go to the myenteric plexus and cause this muscularis externa to move. Long-term reflexes that allow your brain to have some control, essentially. And also hormones that are produced that can have more widespread effects, kind of like your long reflexes, right? So both your central nervous system and your hormones can have bigger effects where you're moving big bits of food residue from one place to another. There are 6 main things that happen essentially inside your digestive system, and we'll talk about each of them and each of the places along the digestive tract and where they happen. But they start with ingestion, which just means food goes into your mouth, right? I'm trying not to touch my face too much. You have mechanical processing, which means actually physically breaking stuff apart. So that's chewing. That's the churning of your stomach. Your stomach is really muscular and mashes up food, right? But that's a mechanical process. You're breaking up big chunks of food into smaller chunks. Chemical digestion is the next part. And in chemical digestion, you are actually breaking chemical bonds, right? So this is a chemical reaction. This is different than mechanical processing. To break chemical bonds, you need a chemical reaction to go forward, and that requires enzymes. So whenever we talk about enzymes, we are talking about chemical digestion. You also have a lot of secretion going on in your digestive system. That secretion could be enzymes, right? So enzymes are a big part of what we secrete, but we also secrete, hydrochloric acid in your stomach. We secrete alkaline fluids in your small intestines to neutralize what's coming from your stomach so that you don't ruin the tissue of your small intestines. Absorption is probably the biggest function of your small intestines, right? We do all that other stuff, like breaking the food down into small bits so that the bits are small enough to absorb. The whole point of this is to bring nutrients into your blood. So absorption, probably the key function of this whole system. And then compaction and defecation. So there's going to be stuff left at the end. Things that we were not able to break down or didn't want to break down. Whatever's left at the end, we have to just get rid of it. We never absorbed it, and that will be the poo-poo. But we've been dumping juices from our saliva to our stomach to our small intestines all along the way. Just liters and liters of fluid we're dumping into this, and we have to reabsorb that stuff. Otherwise, we're going to get dehydrated quickly. And so compaction is where we reabsorb most of that water. And that's very, very important. That happens in your colon. And then what's left, we defecate. And then if you spend too much time in the colon reabsorbing water and you reabsorb too much water, you can end up getting really solid feces that's hard to get rid of. And if you do not spend enough time in the colon and you don't reabsorb enough water, then what you defecate is very, very watery, and that's diarrhea. And when that happens, you can get very quickly dehydrated. Okay, let's talk briefly about the oral cavity. This is the first place food comes. It's bordered on the front by your lips or labia, right? And you have a vestibule between those labia and your teeth. It also includes your tongue, your oral cavity. It's bordered on the sides by your cheeks, right? And in the back by your uvula, right? Your uvula keeps food from falling backwards before you're ready for it. And that's important because you may be chewing and breathing at the same time, and you want to make sure that food doesn't fall back until you swallow, because when you swallow, that epiglottis covers up the trachea, and you don't end up with stuff going down the wrong pipe, and that causes you to cough, and that causes people to think that you might have the coronavirus. Let's see. Jumping up ahead a little bit, you can see all the different teeth. You can see the labial frenulum that holds the lips to your gums. The gums are also called gingiva, right? Gingivitis is inflammation of the gums, and that's why we brush our teeth and use mouthwash. Tongue, pretty important. If you look at an actual tooth, every tooth has a crown, which is the part that you can see, and a root, which is down in the gums, right? So let's just look at a picture. It'll be easier. So the crown is up here. The root is down here. Neck is where they come together. You can see the gingiva here. The outer part of the crown is made of enamel, which is not living, but it is really, really hard. That is what wears away when you have a cavity. Bacteria produce acids, which break it apart. The part of the teeth that touches the other tooth, right, is called the occlusal surface. Below the enamel, you have a thing called dentin, and this is made up of living tissue. And below that, you have a cavity, a pulp cavity. And this is where all the blood vessels and nerves are, right? So it's important for keeping the rest of this alive. And to get blood vessels to that pulp cavity, you have a canal that goes through the root it is called a root canal, and it's full of blood vessels, but also